Good afternoon. I hope you can all hear me okay. I trust you can all hear me okay. So I'm just going to wait for another minute in case anybody else is joining. But thank you all for joining, and we are going to be talking about credit notes today. I can still hear people are joining in the background. So we'll just give it another minute if that's okay. But thank you for your time. So for those of you that have followed our previous webinars, we tend to run them quite regularly. So I do appreciate you joining. Sometimes the information obviously can be more useful than other times, but you know, hopefully there's something for everybody. And if there's ever anything you do want us to cover, please just reach out and let us know, and we'll be more than happy to run through that with you. So I'm Christina. I'm one of the Proactis specialists or consultants. And I'm going to be talking to you today about credit notes. So we'll follow a slightly different format today in comparison to what we've done previously. I do tend to do quite a lot of slides in other presentations, but I'm not going to do that today. So I will be in and out of software. I hope you find that okay and you can follow okay. There will be a recording available for you to download after today, along with a very small amount of slides that I have as well. But I want to focus on credit notes. I think it's something that it's in the application. Obviously, the invite for this has only gone out to existing clients that use Proactis, but credit notes is a part of the core product. It's an exceptionally useful feature. You all receive credit notes, but we do find that some of our clients tend not to use them. Or some of the clients don't necessarily understand how to use them in the most efficient way. And so, you know, off the back of a few support calls that we've had recently and just some general information from our clients, we thought it would be quite useful to run this session. Please feel free to put any questions you have in the chat. Your speakers won't be on, obviously, but if you've got any questions, please put them in the chat or in the Q&A section, and I'll come to them later and address them all. If there's anything you'd rather ask me offline, then please feel free to drop me an email. That's absolutely fine too. And if you would like another session after this, if there are specific queries that you have relating to how your setup is configured and you'd like to take them offline, then again, please just reach out. These are your sessions. They're here to help you as our clients. Okay, so I'm just going to go through. I've got very few slides. You're all familiar with this one. You've probably seen it many, many times, and it just maps out the modules that we have within Proactis and the full capabilities within the suite of Proactis products that we have. So I'm going to be focusing today on credit notes, which comes under receipting, invoicing, matching. Obviously, it's all part of that area. When we talk about credit notes, generally it's because we don't want to pay for something. Okay, so it comes in this area. You do also have the capability now within Proactis to register ad hoc credit notes. So credit notes off the back of a purchase order. So if you've paid for something potentially and you decide, actually, I want a credit, perhaps the goods or service that you paid for is faulty, or you're not comfortable or happy, and you want to request a credit after the event without an actual discrepancy on your screen, then you've got the option to raise an ad hoc credit note. So we'll go through that as well. Okay. There is also the ability to process credit notes through the invoice capture solutions. So I won't show that today, but I will talk about it and the capabilities you have there. So whether you're using the Proactis capture solution, or whether you're using iCat, which is not a Proactis module, but it's a invoice capture solution that we do implement along with Proactis, you have the ability to bring credit notes through those utilities as well, where they're registered automatically without the AP team having to process them. Okay, so these are something to talk about today. So credit notes, it's not just a matter of they're available, they have to be activated. You have to activate the fact that you're going to use credit notes within Proactis. Okay, so along with controlling whether or not they're going to be used, you can also control who can use them. So you can roll out permissions to certain users within the business that will be able to raise credit notes. Now, it's quite important that if you are going to allow your business to raise credit notes, they understand exactly what they're doing. So when I deliver training to my clients, I don't just deliver training relating to the module that they use. So if they're raising a PO, I won't just restrict it to POs. I do think it's quite important that users understand what they're doing and why. So I will extend that training out to invoicing to show them what the AP team are doing, to show them why they're getting potentially discrepancies. And then honestly, then inadvertently, they'll see we're getting a discrepancy and we can request a credit note, and they're understanding why they're getting that notification. Okay, so if you are going to roll credit notes out to your end user base, it's important they understand how they work, how they're expected to process them, and what they're supposed to do moving forward, in relation to inquiries or, chasing up suppliers. So it's part of your business process as well, as opposed to just turning things on. And we can help you with that. So if those are conversations that we need to have in more detail in relation to how your business works and the best approach when it comes to credit notes and discrepancies, then we can have those conversations with you. Okay, we'll talk about how the behaviour of credit notes can be controlled. So you've got certain options within the system where it won't even ask you for a credit note if the discrepancy is less than a certain value. Okay, or you'll give the users the ability to register a credit note for less than the discrepancy amount that's come up. Now, all of these terms that I'm talking about, discrepancies and everything, I'll go through that. I'll talk about what that actually means as we go through. Again, you can restrict who can request credit notes. Some organisations don't allow end users to request credit notes. It's done by the AP team who are familiar with invoicing. And if somebody does need a credit, they'll just route the discrepancy onto somebody in the AP team and they will manage that task. They'll be responsible for it and they can chase it up and chase the credit with the supplier. So you have options available. Some of them are, with tick boxes that we activate, and some of them, again, are part of your business process and how you decide to use it as an organisation. Okay, we're going to go through credit notes. So we're going to go through a basic credit note and just hopefully give you an understanding of why they're generated and when they would be generated. Okay, so typically a credit note would be requested if you're using purchase orders within Proactis and you're registering invoices and the difference of the invoice is greater than the value of the PO, you've got a discrepancy. So you can choose how you manage that discrepancy. It could be a greater quantity, it could be a greater price, or greater value if it's a total cost, or there potentially could be an unexpected item on the invoice that will generate a discrepancy. You can also have discrepancies generated if, for example, the order was raised, the invoice was raised, they might agree. But if somebody hasn't received the goods or service, again, that's going to generate a discrepancy. It's going to tell you that there's something that requires an action. From any of those options, from any of those actions that have taken place, if you've got permissions, you will have the option to request a credit note. Okay, now I'm not going to just go through, this is just a course credit note functionality. Some of you may be familiar with it. Please bear with me because I will come on to how the new features work as well, because Proactis have released new features. Some of them were released a few years ago now, but we find that some of our clients are still struggling to understand how those features work, how it can benefit them, or whether they even need them turned on at all for their business and the way that they process. Okay, we'll talk about direct credit notes. So if you're not using purchasing and you're using direct invoicing, then you would receive direct credit notes. So they're not linked to anything, they're not linked to an invoice, they're not linked to an order, they're just coming into the business, they're being registered, potentially being approved, and then going off into the finance system. Okay. Ad hoc requests for credits. So ad hoc credit notes relate to credit notes that are raised off the back of a purchase order. So the traditional credit notes that was available in the system from day dot relates to credit notes between orders and invoices. And then obviously you've got your direct credit notes. Ad hoc credit notes was a new feature that was introduced. Again, you need permissions to use it. It won't just be available for all users. Again, your business needs to decide whether you want to use it or implement it. But it gives users, the end user, the ability to raise a credit note against a purchase order, potentially that's been fully invoiced and paid. It may have been paid. Okay, if you can imagine, you've raised a PO for some IT equipment and the invoice has come in and you've paid it, but you haven't actually set up those servers or the mobile phones or whatever it is the order and invoice relate to. You might not do that for another 2 months, at which point you decide, actually, these goods are faulty, or actually it's not what we expected. We want a credit note. We're going to send them back and we expect a credit note. Previously, it would be very difficult for you to raise that. You'd have to raise a direct credit note and there would be no link to the order. You would have lost that, the relationship. But the ad hoc credit facility allows you to do that now. So if your order's been paid, you can then go back and register a credit note and have full visibility of it against that PO. Okay. And you'd also have the ability to import credit notes. So I'll talk about how they can come in with invoice automation. So that's my slides. That's the end of my slides now. So I am going to unshare this part of my screen. Just bear with me while I do that. And I'm going to jump into software. So just be... Brynner, if there are any issues, I know our marketing manager in the background. Brynner, if there are any issues with what I'm sharing, please just let me know.
I will let you know, CT. We are still seeing the presentation. Now we can see your whole screen.
You can see my screen.
We can see, yes.
Okay. So as I mentioned, typically I wouldn't be in and out of software. I generally do slides, but I am going to show live software today. I think it's quite useful, especially for something like this. And again, we'll take feedback from you. You know, if you prefer slides, we'll do that and present them to you. But I'm going to log in as a user who would typically raise an order, and I'm going to register that PO. I'm going to register an invoice in it very quickly. I'm going to streamline that process because you know how to raise POs and invoices. And I'm going to show you the screen where you have the capability to request credit notes, and then talk about some of the controls in the background. So I will dip into the Proactis management console and show you the options you have available as well. And then we'll go into things in a bit more detail. Okay, so I've logged in as my end user who raises orders, and I'm just going to very quickly raise a PO. So I'm just going to raise a PO for some training. Select my supplier, put a date in and a value. So let's just say my training was £1,000 worth of training and I expect it to come in September. Let's just try saying it, training for IT department, and I'm going to submit that. Okay, so I'm just going to get that approved. That order's been submitted through the workflow. And I'm just going to log in as my approver. You can see I've got my dashboards presented as and when I log out. Here's my PO. And I'll just approve that PO. Okay, so that's a fully authorized order now. Okay, so at this point, it's ready to be invoiced. Now, I'm just going to go back and view it. So obviously, you do have the option at this point. So once it's a fully authorized order, you've got the authority to spend the money with your supplier. It's fully approved. You can go off and send the order out to the supplier electronically, or you can do it manually, depending on how your system's set up. Obviously, you can set it to auto output if you want to as well. But at this stage, at any point, you could potentially receive the invoice. Okay, now, if we don't process the receipt, that will generate a discrepancy. And off the back of the discrepancy, we'll have the option to request a credit note. Okay, so we're just going to deal with purchase-based credit notes at this stage, or invoice-based credit notes. All right, so I'm going to leave it. I'm not going to receipt it, and I'm just going to log in as the finance team and process the invoice. So finance will receive invoices, whether they come in electronically, whether they come in using the automation options, or whether they register them manually. I'm just going to go in and register my purchase invoice, link it to my PO. Okay, and let's just say it's for today's date. So the values are going to match. I'm going to just attach a scanned image of my invoice. Okay, so I'm presented with my PO line. This is my order line now. So this is the AP team registering the invoice. It will present me with any order lines that are remaining to be invoiced. So we've got our £1,000 order line. I'm going to just navigate to my footer, make sure it all agrees, which is fine. My invoice matches my order, and I'm going to submit that. So if I'd had processed my receipt, because the values agree, I would not be receiving a discrepancy of any sort. Okay, if I just navigate and look at my invoice in my tray, now it does take a moment to update on my demo system, so just bear with me. I found that it has been a little bit slow today. Just go back in and have a look at my order. So here's my PO. So I've got my invoice registered. It's awaiting discrepancy resolution. Okay, so as the user that's raised the PO, I have my system defined to send any discrepancies back to the user that raised the PO. Now you've got flexibility around that too. So potentially you can change the setup of the system and have discrepancies sent to the person who authorized the PO at the first stage or the last stage, or you could nominate somebody. You can also define who receives the discrepancy based on the type of discrepancy. So you have flexibility around that also. But more importantly, we're talking about credit notes today. So the user's received a discrepancy. I've raised an order for 1,000. I've actually received my invoice for 1,000, but I've receipted nothing. Okay, so I haven't confirmed that I've received the training. Therefore, it's asking me to confirm, did you receive it? Do you want to pay for it? So nothing gets paid, nothing gets transferred into the finance system until the discrepancies are resolved. And I've got the option to request a credit note. Okay, so if I wanted to accept the receipt, if I decided, yeah, I just forgot to do it, and I'm going to create the receipt, you can do that using the button, the action button at the bottom of the screen there. Okay, but we're here to talk about credit notes. So the user has the ability to request a credit note. Now, they only have this option because they've been given permissions to it. So again, as an organization, you would need to decide who are the best users to deal with this option, to undertake this task. Do they fully understand what this means by them requesting a credit note? When you use this option in Proactis, what it will do is it will generate a layout. It will generate an output document that can be sent to the supplier. You don't have to send it. You can call the supplier up and say, you know, send me a credit note, but it will generate you a document in whatever format you've defined with your logos and T's and C's, etc. But the system will automatically try and generate that for you. Okay. And then we wait. The system will change the status of the invoice to say awaiting credit note. AP will have visibility of that. They'll have visibility of it in their trays to say that the invoice is awaiting credit note, and we wait for the supplier to send the credit note in. Okay, now the AP team do have additional actions available to them. They can go in and view the requests for credits that have been requested by the end users. They can reprint them, they can re-email them, they can cancel them if they need to as well. So they do have extra capabilities. Again, you know, let's just do this. Let's just request the credit note. I'm going to click next. It will ask you to put some comments in. This is an external comment that if you've defined your layout to include it, then that's what would be printed on the layout. Now, I'm just running a demo system, so my layout doesn't look pretty, but please bear with me. Please provide a credit as we have not received the training. and wish to cancel. Okay. So that comment can be printed on the document. You can also add an internal comment, do not pay. Any comments you add on will be retained on the document, and you'll have full visibility of that within the audit trail. So I can submit that. Again, ignore the layout of the document. You can have multiple credit note layouts if you want to as well. So if you've got different layouts that you want to send to different suppliers, then you can configure as many as you like, and you can choose when you're printing it which one to print out. But that's my layout. Typically, that's what you would send to the supplier to let them know that you're waiting for a credit note. Okay, now the status of that order has changed. The discrepancy has disappeared. The user has dealt with it as far as they're concerned. If I go back to the order, the status will have changed. So it's not invoiced still, even though we received an invoice, we requested a credit. So it shows that on this main screen. So if the users are inquiring on their purchase orders, they have visibility of the status of them. If the supplier calls up and asks why they haven't been paid, then the user has visibility that we are waiting for a credit note and there won't be a payment at this stage. They can also drill down and view the related invoices. We can see it's awaiting a credit note. They can go back in and view the request for credit. They can reprint it, email it. Again, if they want to, they can cancel it. But this is the end user. This is not the AP team. The AP team, if I log in as finance, who would be the team that are responsible for actually registering the credit note when it comes into the business, they can use the search for request for credit feature. So at any point, the AP team, and it's quite important that the AP team do actually keep an eye on what credit notes have been requested, because they're the ones that will be processing them. So we can go in and search for requests for credits. So if any user has requested a credit off the back of a discrepancy they've received, it will appear in here until it's been registered. Once it's been registered and cleared, then it will disappear from here. So this is the one we've just registered. This is the request that just went through. It's not been received, but again, the AP team have visibility. They can reprint it, send a reminder to the supplier, email it, or again, if they need to, they can cancel it. And if you cancel it, it takes you a step backwards. So the discrepancy will appear again on that user's screen and wait for them to action it. So we generated a discrepancy because the receipt hadn't been processed. It would generate you the same type of discrepancy. It will be obviously different wording, and but it will give you the same options if the discrepancy relates to the value of the invoice. So if the order was, for example, for £100 and the invoice came in for 200, you have a discrepancy. Or if the order was for a quantity of 1 and the invoice came in for a quantity of 10, again, you have a discrepancy. So whatever it is that generates a difference will generate you that option. Okay, so before I process this credit note, what I want to do is just take you into the Proactis Management Console just to show you some of the options that are available and some of the controls that you have to support these processes. So I'm just going to go into the user that raised the actual order. Now, users, as I mentioned, it's permissions based, as with everything in Proactis. You've got lots of control and flexibility around who can do what. Request credit notes. The user needs to be given permission to actually request the credit note. If this text box was removed, then the credit note option wouldn't be in the drop down on the discrepancy screen. They wouldn't have the capability to request a credit. Okay, there's another option as well. So request a credit for less than the total discrepancy. So for this example, we raised an order, the invoice came in, it was a discrepancy, but it just generated the credit note request for the full amount. Whereas if you tick the box, the user will have the flexibility of saying, actually, I want to receipt part of it, but I want to request a credit note for the remainder. So they can just request a credit for a portion of it. But again, users have to be given permissions to have these options. And again, to reiterate, they need to understand what they're doing before you start rolling these options out to your user base, the end users. I've come across users that can barely just raise a PO you know, through lack of understanding and staff changes, and you know, we're quite keen to get users up to speed, but you wouldn't expect them to be able to raise a credit note if they can barely raise a PO. So, you know, and if you find that that's an issue in your organization, again, please reach out to us because we're here to help you. Okay, so those are the credit note options for the user. Now, there are other options which I'll come on to in a minute, but there are additional options within company maintenance. Now, these options in here, I would not expect you to be changing them yourselves without first discussing them with us. You have to be very, very careful within this area of the system. It's restricted to the administrators only, and there's a reason for that, is if you accidentally change something without understanding the implications, it can affect the data in the system and it can cause issues for you. So you have to be very mindful that not everybody will be in and out changing these flags. It's not something you would typically do, but I am showing them to you today because I think it's quite important that you're aware of what they are and what they do. Okay, so we've got some flags in here. So the first one here is, does the company use requests for credits? So if I'm talking about information that you don't even see in your system, potentially it's because you don't have the option ticked. You're not using requests for credits within your system. Okay. Secondly, minimum value for requests for credit. Now, if you've got a value in here, so I've got mine set to 0. So even if there's a discrepancy of a penny, it's going to give me the option to request a credit from the discrepancy screen. Now, if you've got in here, I don't know, £10 or £50, then your business has decided it's not worth our while. We're not going to request credit notes where the discrepancy is less than that amount or that threshold. Okay, so again, if you're not seeing the credit note option come up, potentially it's because you've got a minimum value for request for credit in here. So these are some of the options to be careful of or be mindful of. And then we've got two options here: allow credit notes for full invoice value, and ad hoc for credit. Put my teeth back in. Ad hoc requests for credit values can be re-invoiced. Okay, so those are new options. I say new, they appeared a couple of years back now. We have made clients aware of them as we've patched and as we've carried out new features training. But again, you know, they're turned off by default. They wouldn't be turned on unless you asked us to turn them on. So we'll talk about what these settings do and what capabilities they give you as well as we go through. But they won't be available to you unless you have changed the behavior of the actual system. So there are some settings in here that unless you've got them turned on, you won't be able to utilize these new features as well. Okay. And if that's the case, then, you know, we need to have bigger discussions with you about turning those options on, what that means for you, and then giving you access to the additional options. But I've just shown you some of the areas of the system now. So I'll come back and talk about these options in a bit more detail as we go through. But I'm just going to jump back to my web screen. So we've got our request for credit. So obviously that's gone out to our supplier, and at some point the supplier will send the credit note in to you, and you need to register that. Okay, so to register a credit note, you would obviously, again, you'd need access to the credit note documents. They're templates, just like purchase invoice templates and order templates. They need to exist in the system. Okay, you can also have workflows on them if you want to as well. But I'm going to go in and register a document. I'm going to toggle the screen. So I'm going to select credit notes. It will give me the ability to choose which template I'm going to use. Now, if your credit note has appeared with an invoice number on it, so if your credit note has come in from the supplier with an invoice number on it, then it relates to an invoice and purchase order. Okay, so you'll be registering a purchase credit note. So if it's come off the back of a discrepancy that was generated between the order and the invoice, then you're using a purchase credit note template to put this through. Okay, because you also have the ability to put direct credit notes through. If you put a direct one through, it won't be linking it to the PO, and that invoice won't get paid because that invoice is going to stay in the system with a status of matched awaiting credit note. It's still going to be waiting for you to put the credit note against it. So you just have to be careful you pick the right template when you're registering these credit notes. Okay. The second thing you need to be aware of is there are two options here. So when you go off and put the invoice number in, or if your credit note again relates to an invoice, then you're going to be searching for your invoice in this top field. The second one relates to ad hoc credit notes that are raised off the back of a purchase order, not from a discrepancy. So we'll come on to that after. But if the invoice has come from a discrepancy notification, the credit note has come off the back of a discrepancy notification between the order and the invoice, then you will be searching for the invoice to link here. Now, your supplier would have quoted the invoice number on the document, hopefully. So it's easier for you to record it on the screen, but I've just searched for it. And I'm going to add my invoice to my credit that I'm requesting. Now, this credit full invoice value, I'm going to come back to this later as well. Okay, this is new functionality, so I'm not going to use it at this stage, but I will come back and talk about it. Credit note date. So I'm registering it just as I would register an invoice, record the information as it's appeared on the supplier's credit note. And I'm going to make it match and hit next. Okay. Previously, when we registered our invoice, it showed our order lines. Well, now we've got our invoice lines appearing. So we're registering our credit note against our invoice. So it's off the back of the invoice with the discrepancy. I do have the ability to register it for less than the invoice value if the supplier has sent in a credit maybe for 800 and not the full amount. You have the ability to put that in here. Okay, it will still leave an amount remaining, but you'll need to record whatever the supplier has sent. Now, if the supplier sent a credit note in and you don't agree with the value, or you don't want to record it, obviously you can just send it back to them and ask them for a new credit note. It's up to you how your business wants to approach those scenarios, but you do have the capability to amend the value here if you need to. Okay, I'm just going to navigate to the footer. That balances against my invoice. It all matches, so I can submit my credit note. Okay, and what that will do is that will now offset against that invoice. Okay, if I go back and have a look at my PO, so the order that I raised today for £1,200, and if I navigate and look at my related invoices, so I raised my order for 1,000. I've got no invoice value. I do have an invoice, but it's been credited. Okay, so as far as the system is concerned, that PO is available to be invoiced still. Okay, it's not been delivered, it's not been invoiced, it's still open. So the invoice and credit that were received will offset against each other. Okay, if I decide I'm not going to receive an invoice for this order, then obviously you can close it off. You have the ability to close that down so that no future invoices can be received against it. Okay, and that's the basic process of registering a credit note. A nice easy one, invoice, order value exist, and we're just basically offsetting them against each other. Now, you do also have the ability to register direct credit notes. So I'm just going to go in and register a direct credit note, navigate to invoicing, register a document. The same as you would register a direct invoice, you can toggle the screen and select your direct credit note template. None of these other fields will be relevant because it is just a direct credit note. And if you do try and populate them, it will warn you. So we would just go through and register, select our supplier. So depending on, who's sent you a direct credit note. And there may be reasons for having a direct credit note. Now, some organisations don't have the full purchase to pay suite of modules. They just use direct invoicing, in which case you would only be using direct credit notes. There would be no need for purchase credit notes because you don't have purchasing in your system. before ad hoc requests for credits were available, which we will go through, the only capability you had was to raise a direct credit note if you've already paid the supplier. But obviously, as the functionality is extended, its direct credit notes is potentially less used within the system. But I'm going to raise a credit just for Dell. Let's just hit next. I'm going to search for the item it relates to. So let's just say laptop. Same as you would register a direct invoice. I can't actually remember how much I entered the value for, but let's just put in £1,000. I think it was for 1,000. Oh, here we go. So let me code that up. Okay, so I'm just entering the lines. Obviously, you can have multiple lines on your credit note if you need to. That's absolutely fine too. But once it balances, you can submit it. If an approval workflow is assigned to that direct credit note template, then obviously it will push it through the approval workflow process. And then once it's been fully approved, it will hit your finance system for payment. Okay. I don't have approval workflows on direct invoices within this particular demo system, so I'm not going to go off and approve that. But that's the basic process of putting a direct credit note through. It's very, very simple. Okay. Now, you do also have the option to utilize, when we were registering our credit note, we have the option to utilize this credit full invoice value option. Okay. Now, this was a new feature introduced, as I mentioned, couple of years back. I want to say last year, but time goes so quickly. It wasn't. It was before that. We have got release notes with full information. We've got enhancement summary documents that we can send over as well if you need them. So please reach out and let us know. I believe they are available from Freshdesk as well for download if you want to get copies of those. But it will outline in a lot more detail what these features actually do. But I'm going to go through it and hopefully summarize it for you today. So credit full invoice value. So what that will only appear, that flag will only appear on your screen if you've turned on these other options. So allow credit notes for full invoice value. If you haven't got that ticked, you won't be seeing this other option anyway. Okay. And I think the best way to demonstrate this to you really is to just show you what it would do to your order. So again, just as we generated the previous order and we registered an invoice against it and we had a discrepancy, okay, we registered a credit note. The credit note then came in from the supplier. And at that point, we had the option to credit full invoice value, which I didn't do. But I want to show you the difference with when you do tick the box and when you don't tick the box, okay? So I'm going to go into view orders. I raised some earlier. I'm going to go into today's orders. So I raised a couple earlier where I can show you the behavior. So the order, one of the orders I raised today, I didn't tick the box, but they're exactly the same values. I've put through exactly the same scenario. It's exactly the same information, but it does behave differently. So the first one was £1,000 order that went through, and I receipted, summary. Initially, I receipted a portion of it. So I receipted £200 worth of the service. Okay. So there was £800 remaining to be receipted, which I didn't do initially. Okay. But an invoice came into the business. So an invoice came into the business, I think for £1,000, and I requested a credit note. So let me just show you what happened here. If I go into related invoices, so an invoice came into the business. So I had an order for 1,000. An invoice came into the business for 1,000. I'd only received £200 worth of the goods. Okay. So I requested a credit note. I decided I wanted to request a credit note for whatever reason. I can go back and view the request for credit details. If I go back and view the invoice, it might be easier actually. I can look at the discrepancy history. Okay. And I requested a credit note. The discrepancy was at £800. The credit note came into the business. it was registered. Sorry, just bear with me. I want to make sure I've got the right document here. Okay, so the invoice came into the business. I requested a credit note because there was a discrepancy on it because not all the goods had been receipted. The discrepancy was for £800. Okay, I registered the credit note against the invoice. They offset each other. And then I raised a new invoice, and the invoice amount that I was allowed to raise was for 800 because that's all that was left. Okay, so my orders was for 1,000. The invoice came in for 1,000, but I'd already receipted the £200 worth, so there was £800 difference. I'm probably not explaining this very well. There was £800 difference. The credit note then came into the business for the invoice that was requested, which was for 1,000, so they offset each other. When I then subsequently registered the remainder invoice, a new invoice came into the business, I raised it for £800. That's what was available to me without ticking any extra boxes. Okay, without ticking that new box, request credit for full invoice value that's available on the invoice on the credit note screen, £800 was available to me. However, if I did tick the box, I'm going to show you an example where I did tick the box. So if I did tick the box, register credit for full invoice value, it would have allowed me to register a credit, register the invoice, the remaining invoice, the new invoice that comes into the business, not just for the not just for the amount remaining, but for the whole order amount. So I originally had an order for 1,000 and I receipted £200. That left me with £800 of goods or services that hadn't been receipted. That's £800 worth of goods and services that haven't been invoiced as well. So when I don't tick the credit full invoice value, it only lets me invoice for the amount that I've got left on that order. Whereas when I do select the option, credit full invoice value, it allows me to register the new invoice or the subsequent invoice after the invoice and credit notes have gone through for the full order amount, irrespective of how much has already been receipted in the background. Okay, something like this would need to be tested by yourselves before you decide to use it. It's a new feature. As with any new features in Proactis, we always encourage our clients to test the features to ensure that they're comfortable with them before they roll them out to the business and to the user base, and decide who's most apt at using this feature. Because it may not just be your end users, it may need to be restricted to the AP team. Okay, so the behavior of how the system deals with what you're allowed to raise the invoice for or how much invoice value appears for you can be controlled by those switches, by those flags within the new versions of the software. Okay, you can have them turned on. You can still have them active if you needed to. If you wanted to, obviously we'd discuss it with you. You can still have it active, but your AP team don't have to utilize that feature when they're registering the credit notes. Register a document, go into credit notes. At this point, by ticking the box, it will give them the capability of registering an invoice for the full value of the purchase order that was raised originally, irrespective of what else has gone on with it. Okay, so just be aware of that. Now, I also talked about ad hoc requests for credit notes. So in the event that you have a purchase order that has been, as I mentioned, it could potentially be fully invoiced, it could have been paid, and you want to request a credit note against it. Maybe you didn't realise at the stage when the invoice came in originally that it you know, the goods weren't suitable or the goods weren't appropriate, or, you know, you can now do this after the event. So if I go in and find an order that I've registered previously, so let's find one that's fully invoiced. So I've got one here, fully delivered. Oh, that's not invoiced. Here we go. Fully delivered, fully invoiced. Let's use this one. Okay, so I have the ability as a user, if I've got permissions as well, remember, so you're not going to just be able to do this if you haven't been granted access. There's different ways of doing this same task, this same option, but I'm going to do it from within the PO. If I go into the PO and I go to view related invoices, I've got a credit button at the top of my screen. So directly from here, I have the ability to request a credit note off the back of a purchase order. So this is not coming from an invoice that's come in and a discrepancy. It's just a PO, but I want to request a credit from the PO. So I can use the credit option. I can choose which lines I want to credit. So I want to credit this line here. I can click next. I can expand the details. If I want to add additional information or change the coding, I've got the flexibility to do that. Again, I can overwrite the value. I can add additional items if I want to as well, or change the item potentially. If I wanted to just search and add a different item to credit, potentially that's got different coding for this PO, I've got the flexibility to do that too. You'll need to put a comment in. Okay. And I'm showing this option because it's registered in a slightly different way. Okay. So again, just to recap, we can raise a credit note or request a credit note off the back of a fully invoiced purchase order, potentially that's even been paid. So the invoice will have been paid, but we can do it from the PO side of the system. Okay, I can submit my request for credit. Again, that will generate you a document. Please ignore the layout, but that would have your T's and C's and your logos, etc., and any comments. Okay. When that credit note comes into the business, the finance team would register it by going into register a document, selecting the credit note option, and instead of putting the invoice number in that first field, you'll be putting the PO number in the second field because it's been requested off the back of a purchase order. So I can go and I can type my order number in if it's on my supplier's credit that they've sent in, or I can search for it. I'm just going to add this in. Okay, so currently you're probably registering credit notes for invoices off the back of discrepancies, which the invoice number will go into the top field, but if it relates to a PO, it goes into the second field. Okay, and then you will continue to register your credit note and the information that's presented on it. And you would submit that. Okay, so just to recap, just to go over what we've covered, it's quite a lot of information. It's quite detailed. I did say that this would follow a slightly different format to what we're used to within these sessions, but I do hope it's been useful for you. So we've covered off registering credit notes off the back of a discrepancy. So where the order and the invoice have a difference, the users have the ability to request a credit if they've been granted access to it, to that option. Okay, we've also talked about direct credit notes and also ad hoc requests for credit notes. So that ad hoc request for credit note feature, there are additional features available with it as well. So you do have the option, finance have the option to use that feature directly from the menu at the top of the screen. Okay, so it doesn't have to be the user who raised the PO. You don't have to have access to the order module to utilize the ad hoc request for credit note feature. You can do it directly from the invoicing option. Okay, if you've got permissions. Again, it's permissions based as well. Okay, and again, I've mentioned invoice automation. That's the same with credit notes. So if you've got invoices coming into the business using invoice capture tools, then credit notes can also follow that same route. So we can register credit notes using invoice capture solutions off the back of a PDF. The data can be read and transformed and validated, and the credit note will come in automatically. The system will recognize whether it's a credit note that relates to an invoice or a credit note that relates to an order, and it will register it accordingly and end up in the invoice tray. Okay. Now I'm going to just stop sharing my screen for a moment. Just bear with me. I don't know if you have any questions or anything you'd like to go through. Just bear with me. So I think you should be able to see my presentation again, I believe. If I've shared the right screen, Bruna, please.
Yeah, yes, we can see you, CT.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask, or please reach out. It's quite a lot of information to take in. I knew it would be. But as I said, you know, credit notes can work very, very well for an organisation. It's unfortunate that we have some clients that don't use them. And I do think it's because of, you know, lack of feeling comfortable with it. You know, there's quite a bit to it. And as Proactis have released new features, there's even more to it than there was previously. So understandably, you know, it can be a bit daunting. I think the key is to really, you know, decide who's best suited to be requesting them and raising them within your business. And again, as I said, if you want to have those conversations with us, please reach out. This is all standard functionality. You've got it. There's no extra license required. There's no costs. It's part of your standard software that you have. If there's anything that I have shown you today, obviously that you've seen that you would like to see more of, or you've seen on the screens, then obviously again, just reach out and let me know. And if you'd rather discuss this offline, then please feel free to message me directly. Okay, but I don't think there are any questions. I don't think there are any questions in the chat or in the Q&A. As far as I can see. But again, if there's anything you want me to cover, you know, it doesn't always have to be in relation to new modules or sales specific, you know, but anything that relates to functionality that you think, you know, you need to know a bit more about, you need to feel a bit more comfortable about, then again, please reach out to us. Okay. Thank you all for your time. I really do appreciate you joining the session, taking time out to join this one, and there will be more. I believe the next session we're running is relating to requisitions and purchasing, which should be quite interesting. Again, another module that's part of the standard product that you'll potentially be licensed for if you've got P2P, but not all of our clients utilize that. So that will be in a few weeks' time. So please look out for the invitations that get sent through. And if you need more information, let us know. Okay, thank you.